13 days before Russia fired the largest ballistic missile barrage of the entire war at Kyiv, Ukraine's Air Force shot down exactly 0 of the ballistic missiles aimed at its own capital. Not most, not some, 0. And the reason had nothing to do with radar or training or courage under fire. It came down to something almost embarrassingly simple. Ukraine had run out of the one missile capable of stopping them. This is the story of how a shortage on a factory floor in Florida turned into craters in Kyiv, how a war 6,000 kilometers away in Iran quietly decided who lives and who doesn't in a Ukrainian apartment block, and how, in the space of 2 weeks, that same broken shield went from catching nothing to catching almost half of everything thrown at it. Understanding how that happened tells you more about where this war is actually being decided than any map of the front line. Before we get into it, a quick favor. Independent war and geopolitics analysis like this tends to get buried by the algorithm, and a lot of people who genuinely want to see this never do. A like, a subscribe, and a single word in the comments actually helps this reach them. Now, let's rewind to the night everything went to 0. On the night of July 6, 2026, Russia launched 29 ballistic missiles at Kyiv, a mix of Iskander-M and Zircon hypersonic weapons. Ukraine's Air Force spokesman, Colonel Yuri Inat, went on national television afterward and said something that should have been unthinkable this deep into the war. To shoot down ballistic missiles, he said, you need the assets to do so. There are enough Patriot launchers. What's missing is a steady supply of interceptor missiles. He wasn't being diplomatic. He was describing an empty magazine. The specific missile at the center of this story is called the PAC-3, sometimes referred to by its interceptor variant name, the MSE, short for Missile Segment Enhancement. It is, as of mid-2026, the only weapon in Ukraine's entire arsenal that can reliably catch an Iskander-M or a Zircon coming down out of the sky, not the older Patriot rounds. Not any European system currently in Ukrainian hands, just this one interceptor, built by a single American company at a rate its own government openly admits isn't enough. So how does a missile shortage in Ukraine trace back to a war in the Middle East? Because in February 2026, the United States went to war with Iran, and in the opening days of that conflict, American forces burned through what analysts estimate as 18 months worth of PAC-3 and MSE production, trying to shield Israel and Gulf allies from Iranian missile fire. Lockheed Martin, the sole manufacturer, produces somewhere around 500 to 600 of these interceptors a year under normal conditions. A single week of intense combat in the Middle East ate more than a year's output. And once that hole opened up, it didn't just affect Ukraine. Roughly 20 countries are now standing in the same queue, waiting for the same production line, including Japan and South Korea, both quietly stockpiling ahead of what they see as a coming confrontation with China. Ukraine isn't competing with Russia for these missiles anymore. It's competing with half the world. The timeline of how Ukraine actually ran dry is worth sitting with because it wasn't sudden. Analysts had been predicting a PAC-3 shortfall as early as the start of 2026, and by April, it was, in the words of one report, widely expected on both sides of the Atlantic. Nobody was surprised by this. By late May, Ukraine had reportedly used its entire stock, with nothing left in the supply chain behind it. Through June, spokesman Inat was already describing a serious global deficit of both PAC-2 and PAC-3 interceptors, with some units reduced to requesting batches of just 5 or 10 missiles at a time from allies, and entire batteries left sitting half-empty. This wasn't a single bad night. It was a slow bleed that everyone could see coming, and nobody moved fast enough to stop. The human cost of that slow bleed shows up in a number that deserves to be said plainly. According to preliminary figures from the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission, June 2026 saw 265 Ukrainian civilians killed and 1,816 injured by Russian strikes, one of the highest monthly tolls of the entire war. That spike lines up almost exactly with the window in which Ukraine's ballistic missile defense effectively stopped functioning. Correlation isn't the same as absolute proof, but when your only shield against a specific weapon disappears and your casualty count from that exact weapon spikes in the same month, it's not a difficult connection to draw. There's a detail buried in how the Patriot system normally operates that makes this shortage even worse than it sounds. Standard U.S. Army doctrine calls for firing 2 MSE interceptors at every single incoming ballistic missile, doubling the odds of a successful intercept in case the first one misses. In more complicated engagement scenarios, doctrine allows for up to 4 interceptors fired at one target. Ukraine, out of pure necessity, has reportedly cut that ratio down to 1 interceptor per incoming missile. One shot, no backup, against a weapon carrying a half-ton warhead traveling at several times the speed of sound. That's not a tactical choice. That's what it looks like when a country is rationing its last line of defense. Zelensky's public response to all of this was about as direct as diplomatic language gets. Following the July 6th attack, he called it simply nonsensical that, in the modern world, production still hasn't scaled to the level actually needed to protect people from what he called ballistic terror. He wasn't asking for a new weapons system. He was asking the world's most sophisticated defense industrial base to just make more of a missile that already exists. 2 days later, on July 8th, something shifted, at least on paper. At the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, President Trump sat down with Zelensky and, in front of cameras, announced that the United States would grant Ukraine a license to manufacture Patriot interceptors on its own soil. His phrasing was almost casually blunt. "We're going to give them the right to make Patriots," he said. "That's pretty cool, right?" And then more pointedly, "This way he can't complain that we're not giving him enough." I said, "Make them yourself." It's worth pausing on how big a shift that actually is. For most of 2025 and the first half of 2026, the official White House position had been that Ukraine simply didn't need large PAC-3 stockpiles, based on an assumption that Russia and Ukraine were closer to a negotiated ceasefire than they actually were. Trump publicly reversing that position and doing it warmly in front of Zelensky at a NATO summit was as much a political signal as a military one. NATO's broader summit declaration backed it up with numbers. Allies pledged €70 billion in military equipment, assistance, and training for Ukraine in 2026 alone, with a commitment to sustain at least the same level into 2027. But a license is not a missile. Serhiy Bezkresnov, an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister, said plainly that setting up domestic production of a mobile, radar-guided air defense system like this would take many months at minimum, likely longer. Ukraine isn't starting from zero on the air defense front, though. It's simultaneously working with France and Italy on producing another interceptor, the SAMP-T, though some analysts note its real-world performance has occasionally fallen short of the Patriots. And a Ukrainian defense firm called Firepoint is separately developing a homegrown interceptor called Freya, with the first test missiles expected before the end of 2026. None of these are solutions for the missile that's already in the air tonight. They're bets on the missile that might be in the air a year from now. So that's the gap Ukraine was sitting in when Russia decided to test it again, 13 days after the night of zero intercepts. In the early hours of July 19th, Russia launched 41 missiles and 125 attack drones across Ukraine in a single overnight assault, one of the largest combined strikes of the entire war, with the overwhelming weight of it aimed squarely at Kyiv. Ukraine's foreign minister at the time, Andriy Sybiha, called it plainly the largest number of ballistic missiles fired at the capital since the war began, more than 4 years earlier. The breakdown of the missile package tells you Russia wasn't holding back. 25 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 10 Zircon hypersonic missiles, 3 Onyx cruise missiles, and 3 Kh-59 or Kh-69 guided missiles, according to figures released by Ukraine's Air Force. Explosions rolled across 6 separate districts of the city. Rescue workers, medics, and police, nearly 600 of them by the government's own count, spent the following hours pulling people from wreckage and putting out fires that had spread through residential blocks. 1 person was killed, 16 others were wounded. Given the scale of the barrage, those numbers could have been catastrophically higher, and the reason they weren't is the actual point of this story. According to figures from Ukraine's Air Force, of the 166 total weapons launched that night, 126 were intercepted or suppressed, including 18 of the missiles and 108 of the drones. NPR's own count, citing Ukrainian officials, put the number of ballistic missiles shot down at least 17, and noted something important. That figure alone suggested Ukraine had managed to partially replenish its dwindling Patriot stockpile in the roughly 2 weeks since the night it caught nothing at all. Read those 2 nights side by side, and the story stops being about a single missile shortage and starts being about a system running right at the edge of collapse, catching itself just before it falls. July 6th, 0 ballistic missiles intercepted out of 29. July 19th, roughly 18 intercepted out of 41, against a barrage that was, by every measure, larger and more complex than the one 2 weeks earlier. That's not a fully repaired shield. Ukraine's own military analysts and outside observers were careful to note that the July 19th interception rate against cruise missiles and drones remained far stronger than its rate against ballistic weapons specifically, which is exactly what you'd expect if the country had received a limited top-up of PAC-3 interceptors rather than a real solution to the underlying shortage. It's the difference between finding a few spare bullets and reloading the gun. There's also a piece of timing here that's easy to miss if you're only reading the casualty numbers. The July 19th barrage landed in the same week Ukraine was headed into fresh negotiations in Abu Dhabi. Russia launching its single largest ballistic strike of the war at the exact moment diplomatic talks were resuming isn't something that needs a conspiracy theory to explain. It's a pattern this war has shown again and again. The loudest message Moscow sends before sitting down at a table is usually delivered by missile, not by microphone. It's worth being honest about where the uncertainty sits in this story, because not every figure here comes from a source that can be independently verified in real time. The exact interception counts, the precise breakdown of missile types, and the claim about a partial Patriot resupply all trace back primarily to statements from Ukraine's own Air Force and government officials, reported by outlets including NPR, CNN, Bloomberg, and the Kyiv Post. Russia has never confirmed or denied these figures in any detail. What is independently corroborated, though, is the broader shape of the story. The United Nations' own Human Rights Office recorded the June civilian casualty spike, Lockheed Martin's production limitations are publicly documented, and Trump's Patriot production announcement was made openly on camera at a NATO summit with journalists present. The specific math of who shot down what on any given night carries some uncertainty. The trajectory, an empty magazine in early July, slowly refilling by late July, while the war's demand for interceptors keeps climbing, does not. Which is really the whole story underneath the fireballs and the casualty counts. This war is no longer only being decided by who has more soldiers, or even who has more missiles. It's being decided, in a very literal sense, on a factory floor in Florida by a production line that has to serve Ukraine, Israel, Japan, South Korea, and a dozen other customers all at once, all pulling from the exact same limited output. Every ballistic missile Russia fires at Kyiv this month is, in a strange and uncomfortable way, also a bet on how quickly a defense contractor half a world away can keep up. Trump's license to let Ukraine build its own Patriots is the first real attempt to break that dependency. But licenses take months to become factories, and factories take longer still to become missiles in the air over a city under attack tonight. So here's the question worth sitting with. Is the partial recovery we saw on July 19th, going from 0 intercepts to roughly 18, a sign that Ukraine's air defense crisis is actually being solved? Or is it just a brief resupply that buys a few more weeks before the next night when the count goes back to 0? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to keep following exactly how this interceptor race plays out, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is very clearly not the last chapter of this story. Thank you for watching.